My name is Adam. I come from Pinetown in Durban. I'm 34 years old now. I would say that I smoked dagga for at least 10 years of those 34 years. My experiences with dagga started when I was 14 years old. I got introduced by friends of mine. They had an older cousin who was already smoking dagga. He came down to Durban from Johannesburg. And at that time, it was important for me to be accepted by my friends. I wanted to be popular, so I thought that by becoming involved with smoking dagga, that would make me acceptable. And when I finished primary school, I had finished school in the top 5 of the school. I played a lot of sports. When I went to high school, I wrote scholarship exams to go to high school. And I started high school in grade 8A, standard 6A. And it was the following year in standard 7 that I started smoking dagga. From that time onwards, my academic performance just started to deteriorate. So every year from then on, I dropped a grade until I eventually ended up in grade 11D, and I failed that year. After that, I repeated grade 11. I missed 100 days of that year and 100 days of my matric year. When I had started high school, it was a summer school was being run at University of Natal. Because of the marks I was getting, I was invited as a part of a group from various schools in the province to go to visit the university and be introduced to the different faculties of engineering, basically just to decide which faculty of engineering I would join when I finished high school. And there was a good chance that based on the way my results were going, I would have even got a scholarship to study that. By the time I finished high school, I'd lost all of those opportunities. I barely managed to pass matric. In fact, my matric results have even caused problems for me later in life, where I've tried to register at certain institutions. The damage done then has meant that I wasn't able to get into these institutions 20 years later, because they still want to look at those marks that I got during those years. I'd been a very good sportsman. I was involved in about 3 or 4 different sports. I played rugby, I did swimming, cross country, even triathlon. But after I became involved in smoking, any extramural activities just ceased. Even when I came to school, I would decide to go home during the day to smoke dagga. I stopped to respect any authority in the home or at school, so I became rebellious at school. I was verbally abusive towards teachers. I was threatening towards them. So even once when the headmaster tried to stop me from leaving the school, I disregarded him and went home. And by that time, smoking dagga had started to cause psychological problems for me. So at the same time as I began to smoke more and more, became increasingly aggressive and violent at home. So if my parents tried to confront me about where I was going or what I was doing, or about not attending school, my behavior, I would become aggressive towards them so that they would leave me alone and stop asking me questions about what I was doing. So in the end, I became so aggressive towards them that they just stopped asking me any questions. So by the time I was 16 years old, I was already just a law unto myself. And it was also during that time that the psychological symptoms became worse. So I would start to experience hallucinations, and I would start to blur the lines between reality and what was real and what was not. So I started to hear voices outside my window. I started to see things, and I also started to become extremely paranoid. So even though some of those people that I was smoking dagga with were friends that I'd known since I was 2 years old, I started to believe that they were trying to harm me. They had plans. They were setting up plans to harm me. And eventually things became so bad that I realized that if I didn't stop smoking dagga, I was going to lose my mind. So looking back, I can see that I was just walking on the borderline of psychosis. And I'm thankful that I stopped when I did, because I have a friend. I went to primary school with him. I went to high school with him. The last time I ever saw him, he was in a state mental institution because of using dagga. So he will never be the same again. Even with medication, it doesn't go very well with him. So his mind has been damaged beyond repair. And he's not the only person I know of. I know of several others I've met over the years who are permanently psychotic because of using dagga. Unfortunately, stopping dagga at that stage didn't help me. Already because of the dagga I was using, I started to experiment with some other drugs. So when I stopped smoking, it was obvious that I would just continue on with these new drugs that I'd already started getting into. So I started to use drugs more regularly, like ecstasy and speed and drugs like that, what they call the club drugs. So I can quite confidently say that dagga was the gateway that led me into these other drugs. I don't think if I had not started smoking dagga, I ever would have found my way into those things. And that became a habit for a while. And I would still smoke dagga sometimes, although not too much, because I was very wary of what it was doing to my mind. And unfortunately, this world of drugs that I'd entered into now, I had become curious, so I started to experiment with more and more drugs. And at the age of 22, I was eventually introduced to smoking crack cocaine. That had many negative effects on my life at the time, but it didn't take hold of me immediately. So I decided that I would go to live in another country in the UK and try to leave these problems behind me. Unfortunately, when I arrived there, I did manage to find a good job. I did manage to find a place to stay, and I was doing quite well. But I began using drugs again. This time the drugs took hold of me completely, and I began smoking crack cocaine again. This time I lost my job, my house, my place to stay, and because I had no other option at that time, I moved in with a drug dealer and began working with him. So we would sell cocaine and crack cocaine, and his son was also involved in distributing cannabis in the form of skunk, which is very high potency dagga that they have in the UK. I did smoke that. I remember that some of that dagga that they smoke is as strong as LSD, so you can have hallucinations and things like that. And in the end, because of the drug lifestyle I was in, I was arrested for robbing people for money to buy drugs. I was sentenced to 3 years in prison. In the prison, they did use drugs. The two most common drugs were dagga and heroin. And after being released from prison, I returned to South Africa and continued with the drugs up until the point that eventually both of my parents took restraining orders against me, and I ended up living on the streets of Durban. Looking back, I can see how dagga robbed me of many great opportunities in my life, both academically and otherwise. It destroyed the relationships I had with my family, which took years to rebuild. And at the age of 34, I can see how even today I still struggle with many of the traces, at least, of those psychological problems that I caused myself through using dagga. When I look back, I can see that out of all of the drugs that I used, it was dagga that caused the greatest harm to me psychologically. And things became so severe that I moved into using other harder drugs simply to escape from the psychological things I was experiencing, like paranoia and psychosis, while I was using the dagga.